Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay again? Well, thanks for coming, especially because it's a good party happening outside. This is the third lecture or talk I've given in this series, and I thought I'd finish with a little bit of zoo and wildlife stuff because I think it's something that most people that are interested in animals have got an opinion about. And also just the more practical question towards the end of the lecture about whether vets have any responsibility to treat wildlife, which sometimes happens that people bring you wildlife as a vet. So I'm going to talk a bit about zoos, first of all, and some of the ethical arguments for and against zoos, and some of the welfare concerns that they give rise to, and then talk a little bit about environmental ethics, a little bit sort of ecocentric ethics and where that's coming from. And then, as I say at the end, just talk a little bit about the ethics of wildlife rehabilitation and treatment. So zoos, a useful definition of a zoo, I suppose, is a park or an institution in which living animals are kept and usually exhibited to the public. And zoos are not new. There were large collections of animals maintained in antiquity from Roman times right through to now. It was a kind of sign of power and also fodder for these sort of games that people would sort of throw people into the lions and things for entertainment. But what we would describe as a zoo, a sort of modern zoo, was established really in the kind of Victorian era. That was really when what we would recognise as a zoo came into being. Remembering at that time there was no film, there was no television, there was no photography even. So it really was very exciting for people to go and see these animals that they'd never seen before, which weren't in their own country, living naturally to be entertaining. So some people have some concerns about zoos, and maybe you do. Has everyone been to a zoo? Pretty much everyone, yeah. And did anyone have any concerns when they were there? A few people nodding. There are some enclosures that maybe you're starting to, giving you that kind of what we call a spontaneous moral reaction. So what are some of the concerns? Well, animals are taken from the wild in some cases, not always, but in some cases. And there could be suffering related to the way they're captured in the wild and, of course, the way they're transported to the zoo. One of the major concerns really is the concern over the quality of captive care. And that's, of course, with the best intentions. Are we actually able to provide for these animals' basic needs in captivity? And we'll look more at that in a few slides' time. There's an issue, of course, of confinement or lack of liberty, which is an issue for people that are interested in the animal rights perspective. The animal rights perspective isn't just about welfare, it's about respect for animals and dignity of animals and so on. So they would be concerned about confinement in its own right, that we shouldn't be confining animals and taking away their liberty. There's also an issue about surplus animals. Some breeding programs are actually very successful. Some animals breed very well in captivity, and for that reason there's too many of them. The enclosure isn't big enough and there's not really anywhere else to put them, so they can be killed sometimes, surplus animals. And this is, again, from the kind of animal rights perspective, it's disrespectful to use animals in this way as objects for our entertainment. And I think we have to acknowledge that zoos vary enormously in quality. So when I talk about a zoo, that's obviously a very wide term, and the picture, this is a zoo, and this is obviously not a very good zoo, and that wouldn't be anything that would probably happen in this country. But in other parts of the world where there are different ethical perspectives and different ethical landscape in the background, or different economic realities, then you probably would see more of this sort of enclosure being deemed acceptable by members of the public. So welfare in captivity really is one of the major concerns about zoos, and can we really give animals an adequate level of welfare? And let's be honest and acknowledge that many species are very difficult to keep in captivity. Here's, of course, a polar bear, a very kind of iconic zoo species that, of course, we're now trying to conserve because its natural habitat in the North Pole is rapidly disappearing. And really, there's this question of whether we should be trying to preserve polar bears by keeping them in zoos. But of course, captivity usually restricts behaviour, and it's really behavioural restriction that's one of the biggest concerns. So a whole range of behaviour could be restricted by captivity. Feeding and hunting, for example, polar bears, as I'm sure you know, will travel very large distances to hunt for seals at certain times of the year, and also to meet mates, so social reproductive behaviour also. Exploratory behaviour, once you've explored your enclosure, that's it, if you're in a standard enclosure. Locomotory behaviour, again, animals moving very large distances for a variety of reasons, not being able to do that. And even things like resting and comfort behaviours may not be appropriate. Even things like the thermal tolerance of a polar bear being kept in San Diego, you can imagine that's not necessarily where that polar bear wants to be. Let's, to be balanced though, acknowledge that captivity also offers benefits. Okay, so the welfare of wild animals is not always that great. It's not always perfect. And these animals have enough food, they have veterinary care, so if they become injured or sick or parasitised, then they're given appropriate medication and care. And of course, not in the case of the polar bear, but for some species, they're protected from predators. There's no hunting of those animals that would normally happen if you're a prey species. So just acknowledging that there are some sort of benefits of this. Now, whether they outweigh the costs is really the big question. And for some species, that will be a reasonable balance. For other species, it will be much more difficult. So ethically then, what should be the conditions for keeping wild animals captive? Well, we could say that we have to meet the animal's basic physical and physiological needs, and you could even say psychological needs for some species as well. And this is based on what we call basic decency, really. That animals have a moral status, which we talked about in the very first lecture, that for most people, animals that are sentient, animals that can feel, have some moral status. If they can suffer, then they have interests, they have moral interests. And also we should assume that when we keep animals in captivity, we then are responsible for them. It's our job to get this right. Another condition could be that the animal should be provided with a life that is at least as good as it would have in the wild. Now that's maybe hard to work out, but that would be a reasonable kind of ethical position. So a comparable or better than wild equivalent life would be, for most people, a reasonable condition. Now, of course, are these actually justifiable? Is this enough? It doesn't get over the argument about liberty or confinement or respect for animals. Those are not affected by those arguments, really. And of course, most importantly, really, are these actually achievable? Can we achieve the comparable or better than wild equivalent life for animals? For some species, that's going to be very, very difficult. And I think that's worth acknowledging as well. So that maybe they're more of a moral ideal than actually the reality that we can actually achieve. Another moral presumption that many people have, and I think many of you would have, is that if we remove animals from their habitats, wild animals, and confine them, that we're somehow harming them, or at least we're potentially harming them. Perhaps we can't give all their behavioural requirements, as we've already said. Perhaps there's something fundamentally harmful about confining them, and so on. So whatever happens, we may impact on their interests negatively, and that's what harm means in the ethical sense. If you harm another being, you impact on its interests negatively. Now, for animal rights proponents, this is enough, really. You just don't do this, because that's it. This is the wrong thing to do. You don't confine animals in zoos. But for many of us who have more of a utilitarian or cost-benefit approach to ethics or perspective, then we might ask the question, well, if we're going to harm animals in this way, or at least potentially harm them, then it must be because there are some important benefits that we can only obtain by doing this. That's the cost-benefit idea of ethics. If we're going to harm animals, then it's okay to do that, as long as we're achieving benefits that are important and outweigh the costs to the animals that are being affected. So this is the kind of utilitarian idea. So if we're going to justify zoos on a utilitarian basis, we must show that there are benefits, and these benefits are important, and that zoos are the only way to achieve those benefits. So let's have a look at that. And here we have the justifications for zoos, which are these are the benefits really that we're talking about. Entertainment, education, research, preservation of endangered species, and encouraging respect for wildlife. So we'll look at these in turn now. Let's look first at entertainment. Oh, sorry. Can we refute these? We'll go through and see whether we can try to argue against these to some extent, and what evidence there is that these are benefits and that they're worthwhile. And most importantly, do we need zoos to achieve these benefits? These are all important things. I think we can all agree these are good, admirable goals to achieve. But do we need zoos to do them? So entertainment certainly was important for the establishment of early zoos, and most people still go to zoos to be entertained. Perhaps not you, if you've got more of an interest in animals and a biological veterinary interest, but most people, like these children, they're being entertained by this giraffe, I think you would agree, and they're enjoying it, and that's a great experience for them, and that's why their parents or whoever have taken them to the zoo. Now, education wasn't really the reason zoos started to some extent. Sorry, entertainment was the reason that zoos started, but it is important for contemporary zoos. As I say, most people visit zoos to be entertained, sort of ordinary members of the public. And zoos have to cater for this desire. Zoos have to be entertaining. People expect to pay their money and see the animals. Animals have to be visible. And of course, that could be a conflict with certain enclosures where actually, for the animals' welfare, it should be just a mass of bushes and trees where you can't see anything. But people are going to get annoyed if they've paid their money and they turn up and they can't see the animal. They can't see the possum because there's too many leaves on the tree. So there's a kind of underlying push-pull there between what the animals might need in terms of enclosure design and the need for the animals to remain visible. So entertainment is an element of this. Is it reasonable to justify keeping animals in this way for entertainment? Well, I think that it falls down a bit on the utilitarian argument, because it's a minor human interest, entertainment. It's minor, it's not important at all, but it's fairly minor. And this is being contrasted with major animal interests of confinement and perhaps behavioural restriction and poor welfare. So it doesn't really stack up really in that way. And of course we have other ways of being entertained, and I'm sure all of you, like me, were brought up on Attenborough films and all these fantastic wildlife documentaries we have now, which show animals in the wild, and with amazing ways of filming them now, you know, from the helicopters and with animals wearing the cameras and amazing stuff like that. And I would argue that's to some extent even more entertaining than being in a zoo. But there are people that say there's something about seeing the actual animal in the flesh, and maybe you agree with that, that it really means something. I think we should at least acknowledge that. Okay, education is one of the other major arguments for zoos, that people learn things in zoos. And again, this is an early justification for zoos. And it was linked to entertainment, this idea that if you go somewhere and you're entertained, you'll be engaged, you might listen to what you're told or read what you're given, and you know, you will learn because you're interested, because you're being entertained at the same time. And that's what we're all trying to do with lectures, sometimes not very well, is entertain you a little bit as well, keep you interested in the topic. And this is the sort of thing we're talking about. This is from Colchester Zoo, a sort of placard next to a macaw enclosure. And it tells you about where the animal's from and what it eats and its reproduction and its lifespan and its status in the wild. And the conservation concerns, and it's got a map showing where the animal's from. And there's some good information on there. Does anyone read these at the zoo? You sometimes do. Well, you're probably particularly interested, but still, they are there. I'm sure you've seen similar things. Unfortunately, there's not much evidence that zoos are very effective in education, partly because it hasn't really been measured, really. And until recently, we could argue there's a lack of perhaps real educational effort. This is the only educational effort in some zoos, and again, people just don't really read these very often, usually. There's been studies show that the average time spent at some enclosures is 20 seconds. If they don't not a particularly interesting animal, they can't immediately see the animal, they just walk away, and they're not reading this. It would take more than 20 seconds to read that anyway. And they just don't read it, really. Some people do, of course they do, and if it's an animal they really like, they might read it, but they don't read them all. So the public are a bit apathetic about this. They just want to see the animals. And I think it's worth asking too, if we really do want to use zoos as an educational vehicle, what do we want people to learn? What's the important goal here? Do you want them to learn facts about the animals, facts about conservation perhaps? And these are important things to do, but are zoos, again, the best way to achieve this? Again, could films, or someone's even suggested just having an empty enclosure and saying there used to be a macaw in here, but they're so rare now we don't have one. That's actually quite a powerful thing. Obviously, if all the enclosures were empty, you would get a bit hacked off having paid your 20 quid to get in. But you know what I mean? There could be other ways of sending the message about conservation and species preservation. So I think that's just worth mentioning, that education is not always as effective, and there may be other ways we could do it. Research is another argument for zoos. Zoos do support research, they fund research projects, and actually those projects are often in the field, back in some of the parts of the world where the animals come from. I know Edinburgh Zoo funds some work in different parts of Africa, where again they're trying to get local people to stop hunting the bush meat, and they have local people employed as sort of gamekeepers and trying to avoid poaching, and they do really support some of these local communities, which is fantastic. They also employ scientists, which is always good if you're a scientist, and to some extent they make otherwise inaccessible animals available for study. There's certainly been quite a few animals coming through Glasgow Vet School's PM room. I'm sure you're the same here, with occasional exotic things coming through, and some students at Glasgow did a project trying to deconstruct a lion and rebuild the skeleton, which is quite good fun. So again, that wouldn't be happening if we couldn't get a lion in Glasgow if we didn't have them in the zoo nearby. So there's another reason to have them, perhaps. Issues with research, well, again, a lot of the work actually is on the captive animals, and is that valid? Is that a reliable way of looking at those animal species if they're in captivity and they're maybe not behaving, or they're not showing their full behavioural repertoire, for example? Then is that totally valid? Is it representative of the wild counterparts? And all the time, again, with technology moving on very fast, we have better ways of tracking animals in the wild. So maybe there's more we could do now in the wild that we were previously doing in zoos. And again, a lot of the research is into improving captive care, which of course is a good thing, but it's a bit circular in that we're doing work to try and improve the enclosures of animals that you could argue maybe shouldn't be there in the first place. And of course, many zoos do no research at all. These sort of poorer zoos, in both the financial and sort of ethical sense, don't do any research. They're just places for people to go and look at animals. But most of the zoos that we know in the Western world do have a research programme. Okay, conservation is probably the major reason that's cited for keeping animals in zoos. And certainly in Europe, since 2002, the European Zoos Directive now requires all zoos in Europe to have a conservation programme or to be part of a conservation programme. So it's a requirement now, it's not an option. And it's certainly one of the most widely used reasons to refute what you could say is perhaps growing sceptical views towards this type of keeping of animals in captivity. Zoos claim that their contribution is significant, and it is certainly. There's certain species that just wouldn't be there now if it wasn't for zoo breeding programmes. But what's difficult to assess is their kind of overall conservation performance, because we're trying to do a cost-benefit analysis for the welfare cost of the animals and the overall benefit to sort of society or to the world. You need that bigger picture, and that's kind of hard to get because you only really hear about the successes and not the failures. And again, the ethical question here is it okay for individual animals to suffer to save a species? So if we keep polar bears in zoos, I think we'd all agree that we probably can't provide for all of their needs, but we'd probably be able to keep them alive and keep them healthy and maybe even get them to reproduce. And that would mean that we'd be able to keep polar bears on the planet beyond a point at which they would otherwise die out. Is that okay? Is it okay for those polar bears to suffer to save this entity called a species, which is not in itself sentient, but of course you could argue has value? And we'll come back to this with our ecocentric ethics in a little bit. And also, I think it's worth mentioning that some of the most successful conservation efforts have actually taken place in specialised places that the public never see. Some are funded by zoos, though, so again, it could be the paying public at the zoo who are paying for it. But certainly, some of the most successful ones have been in specialised places where the public don't get to go. They don't want the public there. They don't want people, disturbing the animals. They want to get animals that are ready to go back into the wild, and they've got really strict ways of doing that. And for me, one of the biggest counter-arguments to the conservation argument is this one. There are many, many species in zoos that are not endangered. Okay, I'm sure whatever zoo you went to, they'll have highlighted the ones that are endangered, but there'll be lots that aren't. So why are they there? Maybe they're there for education or entertainment, but this is where this argument falls down for me. Just to mention again, talking about zoos, Dolphinaria are not technically zoos, but they are wild animals in captivity, so they come into the same sort of area because dolphins are caught from the wild usually. And certainly their welfare, I would say, is at least questionable in captivity. A large number of them die in captivity and don't live for very long anyway. And also, we're not really seeing natural behaviour here. We're seeing clever behaviour that's been trained. The focus absolutely is on entertainment here, and they're not endangered. So a lot of the arguments, the educational argument kind of falls down a little. The conservation argument certainly falls down. And I would argue the cost that's paid by these animals is high compared to the benefit to society of entertainment, which, I don't know, has anyone been to a kind of SeaWorld dolphin type of place? Did you like it? Did you find it entertaining? It's nodding and shaking the head, so some people okay with it, some people not. It's a personal thing. I've never been to one myself. I actually went to, I was in Atlanta recently, and they've got the biggest aquarium in America or something, and I went. I like going to see fish. I'm ethically okay with keeping fish in big tanks. And they'd recent arrivals are coming to see our dolphins. And I didn't want to give them my money suddenly. I ended up going, but not going to see the dolphins, which is probably not a very good ethical decision. But anyway, difficult. And this, the last point was that zoos encourage respect for wildlife. And that's an argument that zoos have made, and I think that's reasonable to consider. But the counter-argument to that is that zoos actually maybe cultivate the wrong attitudes towards animals and people, that perhaps they've got this responsibility to do it, absolutely, but do they actually make us recognise that animals have importance in their own right? Again, seeing the actual animal can really help with that. Seeing a lion is a pretty impressive thing. Seeing a polar bear is like, gosh, it's bigger than I thought, and really seeing it in the flesh could really help with that. But some places, again, this is more the kind of SeaWorld thing, it's a sea lion obviously painting, and is that really, that's not natural behaviour for a sea lion, it's trying to make an animal do human-like things, so this can go a bit wrong, I think, for the sake of entertainment. And could zoos encourage us people to think that animals are for us, sort of they're there for us because they're being displayed for our entertainment. So it could go wrong, although I think zoos do work hard to try and have the right attitudes and respectful attitudes towards the animals.